Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Briefing. We apologize for starting a few minutes late. We were having a few technical problems, but we now hope that we've managed to get over them. I'm Maurice Hirsch, joining you today with my esteemed guest, hopefully within the next few minutes, Tiltza Shaw, Advocate Tiltza Shaw from the Jerusalem Center, and we will have our special guest with us today, Olga Washington, also a lawyer of South African origin, and who is now working really fearlessly and without any type of really break, as far as I can understand, in advocating for and defending and helping to defend Israel. But as we do as usual, we're going to start with the briefings and the updates from the different war sites. And so we're starting first and foremost in the Gaza Strip, obviously, with the fighting continuing on there as the terrorists keep on fighting and shooting rockets from the Gaza Strip, continuing on with their fighting, continuing on trying to hold on to their last really grip over the Gaza Strip as the IDF forces charge on forward. Unfortunately, yesterday was a particularly lethal day for the IDF forces, and we lost 8 soldiers, officers as well, in one event, in an ambush in the Sajaiya neighborhood of in the northern Gaza Strip. The fighting, as we know, is carrying on, fierce fighting, both in that area, other areas of northern Gaza, further south in Khan Yunis, and also now spreading further south as well. The IDF forces are working both from the ground, from the air, from the sea, really from every direction in order to try and ensure that we reach our goal of destroying Hamas and its terrorist infrastructure and capabilities in the Gaza Strip. What we're seeing in the north is the continuation of what we've already described as the war of attrition. Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy, continues to fire rockets and anti-tank missiles at Israel, always trying to ensure that the Israeli forces are kept at all stages divided between the southern area and the northern area. Olga, thank you for joining us. We'll be with you in just one second. And they are continuing on with their fighting. Today, there were also extensive bombings from that northern area, even as far west as Rosh Hanikra, and other, obviously on the Mediterranean coast, Israel's northern border, and also further in, we're seeing Hezbollah as Colonel Jacques Nira, Dr. Jacques Nira described yesterday, really emboldened and expanding the level of violence from that northern border, really just waiting for them to make the decision as to when to open an all-out attack. At the moment, Israel, at the request of the US and the Biden administration, not carrying out any type of preemptive strike against Hezbollah, even though they've already managed to cause the evacuation of some 60 to 70,000 of our civilians from that northern border and continue threatening them. In Judea and Samaria, we've seen also intensive activities and operations from the IDF, focusing again on the northern Samaria area in Jenin, more terrorists being both arrested and killed, underground tunnels being discovered there as well, and really vast amounts of ammunition that was in the hands and in the possession of the terrorists. Further around, we are continuing to watch carefully the developments with the Houthis, another Iranian proxy acting from Yemen, and really dealing with that whole situation of interfering and interrupting with the international and free navigation. That's something which, as we know, will have to be dealt with sooner or later, whether it be Israel by itself or Israel as part of an international effort, or just the US and partners dealing with that threat in and of itself. Within Israel, we've maintained a calm. There has been no real up spike in the violence as we thought and possibly feared there would be, as there was in May 2021. So our situation there is relatively calm. So without further ado, we'll turn to Olga. Olga, as I mentioned before, is a South African native, really a tremendous advocate for Israel, for defending Israel. She started her career as a lawyer and has developed into many other fields. Today, she is, if I'm not mistaken, the Chief Executive Officer of DAISY. DAISY is the opposite of the BDS movement. It's a movement that defends, embraces, invests, and supports investments in Israel. So really, thank you, Olga, for joining us. With Olga today, we're gonna discuss a little bit about the use and abuse and the misappropriation of the term apartheid, which we know from South Africa. Spoiler, I apologize for putting it in now and not too later on. But it's I'm also South African born, as many people will know. My parents were part of the anti-apartheid movement. My mother worked for Nelson Mandela. We eventually left South Africa in 1981 after my parents were arrested, both of them, and myself. I was 6 at the time. My brother, who was 8, and my sister, who were 10, were all left by ourselves as the police dragged them off. Sometimes you just have vivid memories from your childhood that just never go away. Those are one of them. And so we're really honored to have you here today with us, Olga. We're going to discuss really the misappropriation of the term apartheid. People use this term, they bandy it around. They don't really know what it means. As Vincini says in The Princess Bride, you use that term often, and I don't think you know what it means. So to give us a little bit of an introduction, Olga, and then we'll move on to questions and answers as we go through on how we develop the conversation from there.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on today's show. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on who's zooming in, who's watching the Zoom. I did not know that you were South African, so it's a pleasure to meet a fellow South African. And I do want to say, because you included it in your introduction in the link to South Africa, thank you so much for your contribution and your family's contribution to the liberation of Black South Africans like myself. Oftentimes when the apartheid libel is thrown around, it's mentioned of the fact that it was only Black people that were fighting for the liberation of South Africans, very well forgetting that there were many, as my mother used to say, very many pale-skinned brothers and sisters that were also fighting for our cause, and also the Jewish people. They played a prominent role in the liberation movement of South Africa. So thank you very much. By way of introduction, you've already said that my name is Olga, and I go by Olga Meshoe Washington. I came to the United States about 6 years ago. The intention was to get an MBA, and in getting my MBA and studying for it, I met my husband, and now we have 2 children, and I'm still here. So my mom used to laugh and say, I sent you to America for 18 months to get a degree and come back home, and you still haven't come back. But I'm grateful for the time that I've been here. I do still wear the hats of Chief Executive Officer of DAISY International, which is, and I love your analogy of it being the opposite of BDS. It is a nonprofit that my father, the Reverend Kenneth Meshoe, who has been in this space for many, many years, he's a prominent and vocal and proud voice in the South African Parliament in standing with Israel as well as with the Jewish people, uncompromisingly so. He was in the United States. He saw the work of BDS, and he came home very passionately and said we needed to start an organization that was going to challenge the narrative of the BDS movement and make sure that Black South Africans who hold the moral authority in terms of what is apartheid and what it is not were educated, not only in relation to Israel and the Middle East, but also in relation to their own history, so that we can actively address this narrative, not only address it in terms of education and how we speak and how we engage, but also, like you mentioned in our name, investing in the people of Israel, investing in the economy of Israel, investing in the opportunities that Israel presents for Africans. That's another conversation for another day. It's something that I'm very passionate about what the economic ties between Africa and Israel represent for the prosperity of the African continent. So he started that in 2013, and I'm very grateful to have been very involved in the beginning, less involved over the last couple of years just because of my studies and becoming a mom. But we still have an active base in South Africa. And unfortunately, or rather fortunately, depending on the lens that you look at it, since October 7, there's been a spike in interest as well as a need for continued education and activism. And so Daisy's kicking up there as well. The other hat that I wear, I've already spoken about the fact that I am a wife. My husband is Joshua Washington. He's the executive director of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, an organization that works very, very closely, has a good friendship with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. We're very grateful for the work of Dan and Teresa and yourself and many others. And then the last hat, I guess, outside of being a mom, is as the Chief Operating Officer of an organization called Club Z. It is based here in the United States, and what it does is that it trains, one of our mottos is that we train the next generation of American Jewish leaders. So young Jewish kids, we engage them. As people may know, anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is not only prevalent at college campuses, it has seeped down into high schools and unfortunately also middle schools. And so we are engaging them while they're still in middle school and high school, teaching them about their Jewish identity so that they're proud, so that they recognize their connection as Jews to the land of Israel. We want to ensure that they are proud Zionists, that they can then articulately stand up for themselves, stand up for the Jewish people, as well as stand up for the people of Israel. And so all of those things keep me busy.
It's amazing. It's amazing work that as I described before you, possibly before you joined. It seems like from the volume of your activities that you don't seem to know much sleep, and to hear that you're also trying to deal with a few children. So you probably sleep a few hours a day, and that's an amazing thing. And really, thank you. It's always amazing to hear when people are so involved, and as President Biden said, much to the disgust of many of the Palestinians, you don't need to be Jewish to be a Zionist. You don't need to be Jewish to be a friend of Israel. Sometimes it's just plain simple moral clarity, which seems so lost on the way. Part of that lost on the way was the whole hate feast in South Africa in 2001, in Durban, the start of all of those activities of really adopting the change in attitude, adopting the change in tactic, and now saying, you know what, all of us NGOs, instead of, it was meant to be a conference on racism, it turned out to be probably one of the most racist conferences ever held, and really there was the change in tone, moving in direction, changing the whole language that these organizations used, focusing on let's appropriate the term apartheid and stick it onto Israel. Most people, unfortunately, have no idea what apartheid is, and I think that it bears even the time of that we have, whilst it's limited and really is very very valuable. Just explain, please, Olga, to our viewers, what exactly apartheid was. What does apartheid mean?
So apartheid was an institutionalized system in South Africa from the years 1948 all the way through to 1994, when the government of the time, the National Party, and it was a government representing white people who were and remain the minority of the population of South Africa. In very simplistic terms, they then used legislation to codify how whites as well as non-whites were to live. In all areas of society, they had over 150 laws that separated Black people from white people. From the most frivolous of things to you could not date or hang out with somebody of a different race. You could not go to the beach. You could not go to the same restaurant. You could not eat off the same plates. My parents tell me stories of how when they would go to a restaurant with a white person, they would have to use the back entrance because that was only good enough for the Black people. And then they would have to eat on tin plates whilst the white people could go through the front center of the restaurant and eat on regular plates. So simple things like that, even though they were very degrading as well, to very serious things such as our healthcare. We could not access the same hospitals and the same doctors. We were not afforded the same healthcare. Education, our educational system was deliberately dumbed down for Black people because, and this is how I explain it to our young people, The mentality was that Black people are so racially inferior that racial inferiority also impacts their capacity, their ability to rise up into society. And you could not then be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or anything like that. So there needed to be an education system that would keep us down, that would keep us dumb. We were seen as only capable and worthy of being servants, of being workers. And so the education system, unfortunately, fostered that and helped that. You also could not vote. Right, the ordinary Black South African for the first time voted in the year 1994, which is when apartheid came down. We could not vote. We had no say in the affairs of the country. We were limited in terms of how we could participate in the economy. And also, very egregiously, we were physically removed from our areas of living, right? So families were displaced, communities were displaced for no other reason because we were Black. So we were displaced and we were moved to different parts of the country so that white people could have better access to better parts of land, to more productive lands. We were then put on the outskirts. And then if we wanted to move to different locations within our own country, remembering we were still kept as citizens for the most part, we had to have permission. Imagine having to have permission to go from one city to the other within the same borders purely because of the color of your skin. So that was race, that was apartheid. It was more than just racism. It was an evil way of oppressing citizens, treating them as second class purely because of the color of their skin. And that is not what happens in Israel at all. So it is not only ignorant of people to say that, it is abhorrent of people to say that. Let me also mention this because you spoke about 2001. Unfortunately, what we've also seen happen is that this lie, which is actually a product of Soviet Union propaganda, all the way from way before 1960s, 1975, we had the passing of Zionism as racism and those tenets. So we had the shifting of the libel and the attacks against Israel from a geopolitical space to a human rights space. And so people now march on the streets proudly saying that they are upholding human rights values by protesting the fact that Israel is an apartheid state. Meanwhile, by doing so, it's an affront to Black people who really suffered apartheid, and it also erases our history. If everything becomes apartheid, what truly is apartheid? So it is evil, it is wicked, and it also acts as a smokescreen to really address the suffering of the Palestinian people, of the people in Gaza at the hands of Hamas.
So given that, Olga, and I truly understand it. I've written, albeit with my previous employments with Palestinian Media Watch, I wrote a series of articles comparing really that claim of apartheid. And how it really relates to Israel, comparing, for example, what you just said, zero representation in the parliament, zero right to vote, whereas Israeli Arabs have the full right to vote. They have had since the beginning of and the founding of the country, the right to representation in the parliament. In at least in the 2019 elections, which I covered, Israeli Arabs were no less than 12% of the representation in the Knesset itself, in all different types of parties. Of the Arab-only towns, this is what we found: the Arab-only towns, because there are some towns which are Arab-only. They out of choice, obviously, not forced. 27% of those who voted actually voted for Zionistic party, incredibly. But then on the other side of the map, when we discussed the land laws, as you mentioned, apartheid started as an official policy in 1948, but really its roots are already with the Land Law Acts from the mid-30s and even earlier, preventing any person of color from owning any piece of land in South Africa that wasn't in a specific defined area. And really the comparison there being more to the Palestinian Authority, which still to this day has a rule and a law, not only a rule, that says that it is illegal to sell land to Jews. And the punishment for that is actually, one case has been a life in prison, but it's actually the death sentence. That's how the Palestinian Authority sees the severity of selling land to Jews, again, based solely on racial and ethnic criteria. But so what would you say to all of these organizations? I mean, Israel has been under quite a substantial attack from this claim. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all of these organizations issuing report after report basically rewriting what apartheid is, redefining apartheid, and then imposing it upon Israel in order really drawing the full target, and only after that deciding, well, how are we going to put all this into what we want? How would you respond to Kenneth Roth and Amnesty International when they say that Israel is an apartheid society?
Well, first of all, as an attorney and somebody who appreciates history as well as research, I would say to them, how dare you, right? And that's after having said, how dare you in relation to using my history as a Black person and appropriating it. If one reads, which I have, the Amnesty International report, the Human Rights Watch report as well, it is lazy, it is incoherent, it is, I also use a phrase that they commit like legal gymnastics in order to try and maneuver around. They'll start with, this is the definition of apartheid, to kind of link it to South Africa, and then pull up examples that either have not been substantiated or have not been fully researched, and that don't even apply within the borders of Israel proper. That's the other thing. Many people are lazy to recognize the nuance of what the situation is in Gaza, what is the situation in Israel proper, and what is the situation in areas A, B, and C, and why, right? So just because you're going through a checkpoint, people will be like, there's an example of how you need permission, just like Black people did in South Africa in order to move from place to place. And it's like, no, like it's very different. You've got to dig through the nuance. So how dare you in relation to your appropriation of another people's history, Black people's history, for your own agenda? How dare you in relation to being intellectually lazy, misleading people deliberately because you won't thoroughly research, you will misappropriate or misuse as well as misapply the international laws? Really, how dare you? And also, particularly in relation to Amnesty International, that organization has been discredited with regards to its credibility on issues of human rights. Very silent on the issues, for example, of the Nigerian genocide that's taking place today on the African continent. Very silent in relation to the over 1 million slaves that are present on the African continent. And there's multiple other examples. So here is an organization that has gone off of the fact that it is a human rights entity, but has become discredited over the years, both in terms of what it does, its conduct, even in relation to its staff, and also just how lazy it's become, relying, unfortunately, on I would say, in a world where everything is just so quick and so fast, people are not willing to put in the hard work to ask the questions, to say, but this doesn't make sense. What do you mean by this? And so relying on people to just accept what they're saying. My challenge, though, is actually not to them. It's more to the people that are taking up this information to say that you are being lied to, you are being deceived, you have been taken for fools. They are relying on your unwillingness at times to really demand integrity in reporting, integrity as well as moral clarity in what's being said. And until the general public starts to demand better from organizations like this, I'm concerned that this is going to continue to be perpetuated.
So I fully accept, obviously, your argument, Olga. The problem that I have, and really that is part of the really wider, possibly geopolitical question. How is it that the South African government is so on board with this claim of comparing Israel to apartheid and saying that Israel is an apartheid country? Why is the government there? Why is the ANC so really happy and willing to give up on really what is one of maybe the founding parts of the ANC? It was that revolutionary movement to crush that evil that was apartheid. And now they're saying, well, it wasn't that bad, and it also applies in Israel. How do you explain that change in really in South African politics?
So think of it like an onion. There are multiple layers, and as one peels off the layer, it's like, oh, here's an understanding on this aspect, here's an understanding on this aspect, but it's layered. So let me address a few of those layers. The first one is that because of the history of apartheid, we have had a history of ties with Russia, with Cuba, with Venezuela. So we've got this ideology, this mentality that has that was exposed to many of the individuals that are now in government in South Africa. So that's one of the almost like the soft points for why this ideology in relation to Israel being an apartheid state has been so readily accepted. The second is that during, again, the liberation movement of South Africa, leaders of the African National Congress were very friendly with Yasser Arafat. And so there's this friendliness, there's this relationship. I don't want to use the word kingmanship, but there definitely was a relationship between the African National Congress. You would have seen, at least those that have done their research would have seen pictures with former President Nelson Mandela as well as Yasser Arafat. So the whole notion of, because we were part of the same struggle, right? The Palestinian people having to be liberated from the colonialist Israel entity. Here we are as South Africans needing to stand side by side with them. We also, unfortunately, have had I'm not going to be politically correct, but we've had an Islam agenda in South Africa that has grown. Many Muslims that have come to prominent positions within South Africa. And with them coming into very prominent positions, they have brought along this particular ideology. They've also brought along a access into the South African government that has unfortunately influenced them in relation to Hamas. Just a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, Hamas was welcomed in South Africa with open arms. And when people were all up in arms, I was like, guys, Hamas was in our country in 2018 and 2000 and years beforehand. They've been whining and dining and wooing South Africans. The other layer is money. Right? There is a lot of money that's linked to some of these activities. There are politicians who, if you dig deep into their history, they were very much pro-Israel. And when I say pro-Israel, I actually mean pro-truth as well as pro-Zionist. The ordinary South African, and in fact, the ordinary African is more Zionist than they are anti-Zionist. It's in our DNA. Again, a conversation for another day. So you would see them espouse these particular values that are aligned with African values. And then when the money comes and the offering of power and the offering of influence comes, then you see the shifting of the narrative in South Africa. So as a South African, it has been very, very, very painful to watch. My parents went to school with with the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. Maybe I'm saying former president as being prophetic. We've got elections happening in South Africa next year, so we need to get rid of the African National Congress. So they went to...
Although President Ramaphosa himself has been quite friendly and quite supportive of Israel.
Which is, I mean, I was about to allude to that. Like, my parents went to school with him. Like, they know him personally, and they know that this is not the man who said that he was in relation to being a Christian and being a man of integrity, being a man of moral clarity. But unfortunately, he's compromised, and I say this with the utmost respect to him, he's compromised in various areas. And today it has gotten to a place where I'm not convinced that in the core of his heart he believes this, but he's allowed himself to be put in a corner where he almost like has no choice. And no, I don't say that to say that he cannot make decisions for himself, but he owes so much in terms of favors as well as strategy, as well as I mean, there's been various scandals that have happened in relation to President Ramaphosa as well as the African National Congress that I wouldn't be surprised if there's some, if you don't do this, and this is what's going to happen. It is heartbreaking to see, because not only has it raised the threat of violence against the South African Jewish community, but it is also ordinary Black South Africans and ordinary white South Africans, ordinary South Africans, period, that are suffering as a result of that. And so I've been asking that Hashem will have mercy on South Africa until such time as we get these leaders out and bring leaders back in who will have the courage to speak truth and who will have the courage to educate our people, as well as allow, let me not even say educate people, let me take that back, because there is education that's happening. It's happening on the ground, it's happening grassroots, but we need leaders who will allow these voices to be heard more and more.
And one of the possibly the more frightening things that we saw as part of the developing war situation was also the vote in the South African Parliament to close the Israeli embassy after Israel recorded its ambassador for consultations. Have we lost South Africa? Because South Africa, really, for our viewers who are less familiar, South Africa within the African Union is probably one of the most dominant countries. And really does have the ability to take Africa and the entire continent almost in one direction or another. Have we lost South Africa? Have we? What chances there? I don't know enough to really intelligently educate our audience about the alternatives to the ANC. Are there other political parties that are more favorable to Israel, less favorable to Israel? Are we getting rid of the ANC in favor of a more Islamist government that will be even more hostile? Where are we going with South Africa as really as the microcosmos to the entire African continent?
That is the question that needs to be answered. And that is also a question that anybody who cares about the well-being of the African continent holistically, no, it is not saying that Africa is the most important player, but it is a very important player for the reasons that you've just articulated. So anybody who cares about Africa, whether you don't care about the people, but you care about the resources, because Africa has enabled many countries to not only become rich and wealthy, but to maintain their richness. If you care about that, if you care about human capital, African people in the diaspora, as well as Africans on the continent, are contributing to the industries of many nations because our growth rate is at a rate that is not being matched by other nations. The last report that I saw in the year 2030, we're going to be seeing about half of the world's population half of the population on the African continent is going to be young people. So think about that in terms of labor and manpower. So for whatever your reasons might be, even if they're selfish reasons, you have to care about Africa, even on the political space in the United Nations and. So where South Africa is it's at a precipice. People need to make a decision about the type of future that they want. I do think that things are going to get worse before they get better, but get better they will. Again, for several reasons. One, as a Christian, I fully believe that God has got a plan for Africa, and that plan includes South Africa, as well as South Africa's role in leading nations, Africa's role in leading nations to Israel. The first diplomatic endeavor that was taken on with Israel came from Africa, and Africa is once again going to resume that important leadership spot with regards to diplomacy in Israel. But also, like I mentioned a few moments ago, the ordinary man and woman on the street is Zionist, right? They are Zionist and they care about themselves. Israel has got so much to offer South Africa as well as other countries on the African continent: counterterrorism, health, water, education. I mean, so many things that the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs has highlighted in its work and continues to highlight in what it does. And so when there's a recognition that this is what we need for us, I do believe that there's going to be a shift in relation to that. Speaking more specifically to the elections that are happening next year, I think they're going to be in about April, May. The date has not yet been announced, but historically it's been in April or May. Many political pundits are noting the fact that this is likely going to be the first time since the dawn of democracy in 1994 that the African National Congress is not going to receive the majority of the votes, which then means that there is going to be a need for a multi-party governments of unity, which will then see many other parties come and have to work together. And as may have been highlighted possibly in previous efforts on this webinar, we've got parties such as the not the African National Congress, the African Christian Democratic Party. We've got the Democratic Alliance, we've got the Patriotic Alliance, amongst many others that do have a friendly stance towards Israel because they recognize the role that Israel has for purposes of the betterment of not only South Africa, but also Africans. And so my hope is that in the coalition governments, the governments for unity that have to come together because the ANC is not going to get the majority, that will force some strategic roles to be assigned to people who will then change the narrative as well as change South Africa's diplomatic position on Israel. So a long-winded answer, but many things that are in play. In summary, I do think things are going to get worse before they get better, but not all hope is lost.
So maybe I'll join just a few of those points together for just one final point. Our time is moving on, and it connects in with the question that we've received from our audience, from Brian Graw. If we look at what's going on in America on the campuses, and we see the nature of the education that the US future leaders are receiving, and really that hostile environment in which they're really being educated, where they can't even say that calling for the genocide of the Jewish people is a is something which is unacceptable and harmful,
Yeah.
and really can't be tolerated. What's going on the campuses in South Africa? What are the student movements talking about there? What direction are they going in as the potential leadership or future leadership of South Africa in 10 and 15 years?
So we need to understand that there are two narratives happening. There's the life narrative, and then there is a narrative for purposes of political pandering or being seen as to what is your position on the international stage. South Africa has got so many issues that impact students on a day-to-day basis. How am I going to get to school? What is a transportation system going to look like? How am I going to eat? How am I going to feed my family? South Africa has got an official unemployment rate of approximately 33%. 33% of that, and that's the official rate. The unofficial rate is closer to 40% and just a little bit higher. Of that, approximately 70% of those are young people who are unemployed. So most of these students on campuses are trying to figure out that when I get my degree, am I going to even get a job? They are not interested in the geopolitics as well as the fighting and the different narratives that are taking place in relation to Israel. So for them, and this is why it's crucial that we get to them now, sooner rather than later, to showcase them that in the meeting of your day-to-day needs, Israel is a friend. She has been a friend to us. She's been a friend to us since the dawn of many of the liberations and countries moving from colonialism into democracies. She's been there for us, even in South Africa. And so where there is pressure to then stand up and to attend a rally and to take on flags, which you don't even understand the meaning of, and chants that you don't even understand the meaning of, put that down, because that's not going to help your future. So yes, we have seen an uptick in relation to condemnations of Israel and calling Israel an apartheid state and saying that they don't want anything to do with Israel. And sadly, also, we've seen Hezbollah flags and we've also seen ISIS flags on these college campuses. But it's by such a small number of people, and those people don't even know what they're doing. So if I may highlight the importance of the work of Daisy, is we are speaking to these young people on a issue-to-issue basis in terms of what matters most. How does it relate to them? Why is Israel important to them as they go to school, as they think about careers, as they think about innovation, as they think about starting their own jobs? How has Israel been feeding us with Israeli technology, and how have we benefited in that regard? And then showcasing to say, here then is a relationship that we need to continue versus just shouting and screaming for a cause that actually wants not only the destruction ultimately of the Jewish people, is not helping the Palestinian people in any way, and is going to come for us. What starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. We have got historical data on how African countries in the 1970s, when they cut their ties with Israel, they kicked the Jews out of the countries, and then they came for the Black Africans too. They don't care about us. And so lots of noise on the college campuses, but not as egregious as what's happening here in the United States. I am very nervous about the United States college campuses. I can tell you now, my husband and I, we still will be living in the United States when our boys go to college. We will not be sending them to these college campuses. Some people have been calling for the resignation of these three presidents that testified before Congress. We know that one of them already resigned. Yes, they can resign, and then what? It's not going to fix much of what we're seeing. So there needs to be some institutionalized dismantling, unfortunately, of many of these universities. So South Africa's got some work to do, but thank God we're not as in a bad place as America. And that's why we need to also shift focus to ensuring that it does not get to where America is.
An important message on a closing note. I have to say that it's important for many of our audience to understand. It's something that, as you said, with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs have already discussed, and are trying to build those bridges between Israel and the African continent. Africa is made up of dozens of countries that have an incredibly strong voice. And they can use that voice either in favor or against Israel. Unfortunately, it's too often used against Israel, and I think that's a shame, because I think that we have a lot of both shared and common history, and a lot of ability to work together for the benefit of both our countries and continents even. And going forward, we hope that will be really the case. Olga, thank you very much for joining us. I again apologize to our audience for a few minutes starting late, and that again our time has run away from us, and that we need to finish before we've really even managed to really scratch the surface of the conversation. We didn't even get to the part about apartheid being part of the ICC and the International Criminal Court, and what that means, and going forward. I will, if I may, Olga, reserve some time with you in the future, both in your legal background and in your South Africa background, and to tie them all together, so that we can really get into those conversations as well. And if we can invite you back soon, we would I'm sure, very much appreciate that. Thank you to everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are now finishing day 68, I think, of the fighting, coming up towards. And yesterday, the update that I forgot to give at the beginning was that yesterday, as part of the fighting, two soldiers or two bodies of kidnapped Israelis were returned. One soldier, one civilian. The questions were asked as to why Israel was willing to endanger the lives of soldiers, and indeed soldiers lost their lives trying to free those bodies. The importance of that can't be understated, and it's something that we will be discussing really further on down the line next week. Tomorrow we'll be joined by Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser, also from the JCFA Center for Public Affairs, and ex-head of the research department of the Israeli intelligence. And so for today, everyone, keep safe, have a good day, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you very much.